Hello everybody, in this video we are going to be going over the history of video game consoles. Now I even have my little Zelda Link's Awakening remake shirt on. I am pretty excited to be talking about this with you guys. And let me just explain what we're going to be doing in this video. Since you came here as a video game history program for the library, we are going to be going from roughly Atari all the way through modern consoles. We kind of brush over the more modern consoles because most of us still remember them and are playing them. And we talk about a lot of the older consoles from like 20 plus years ago. This is a really cool opportunity to learn about how these different video game studios evolved along the way and kind of developed to become what they are with their video game consoles. Now, I can't possibly talk about all of the video game consoles, so I do encourage you to go out and do some research, to go check out the different books in the library on these video games. And we do have video games that you can check out at the library itself and give them a go. You'll be hearing me mention Mario Kart so many times throughout this. Just go play some Mario Kart. It's so fun. But there are so many video games we're not going to be able to get to, and video game consoles. Atari especially made quite a few that a lot of people don't know about. And we can't talk about all those ones like the Atari Jaguar in this video, but perhaps in the future we will. The ones in this one are all the main ones, and we go over some of the key points, when they came out and how well they did and what games came out for them. So this should be really fun, and I've got pictures for all the video game consoles, and it is just going to be a great time. So let's get right into it. So the first video game system that we are going to be looking at is the Atari 2600. Now, the Atari 2600 was a system that was produced from 1979 to 1992. For a lot of people, this is the genesis of home video game consoles. This is where it all started. And when I say genesis, I don't mean Sega Genesis, which we'll get to later. But the Atari 2600 was kind of the first mass-produced video game console that would really establish what a console meant to be in front of a TV inside people's homes. The original price of the Atari 2600 was $199, which by 2019 standards with inflation is about $899. That's absolutely insane. So you kind of had to have some money to buy video game consoles back in the 70s and 80s. The Atari 2600 also brought Pong even more to the masses, and it even had these little paddle roller steering wheel controllers that you could move the paddle in Pong with, and the simple one joystick, one button controllers that the 2600 utilized really worked well for games like Pong. In fact, many of the games for the Atari systems would be based off of arcade games, so they were really simple and they were really easy for people to get a very simplified version of their favorite arcade games. The Nintendo Entertainment System. This was my very first video game system, so personally, it's a little close to my heart. Now, this is also one of my favorites on the list because it was just so simple and accessible, and video games really were going through a struggle after the video game crash that resulted from Pac-Man and E.T., which ended up buried in deserts. Yes, E.T. for Atari 2600, which we talked about earlier, had a stockpile just buried in deserts. It's crazy. And I actually have a copy of E.T., so can't say it's a good game. So this Nintendo Entertainment System came out in North America in October 18th, 1985. And this was really one of the more affordable systems for people and would go on to be one of the best-selling systems, with 61.91 million of these things sold worldwide to date, which is absolutely insane. It had 2 controller ports, it had an expansion slot. This thing had famous games like the Super Mario Bros., which was a pack-in that sold 40.24 million. It had Super Mario Bros. 2, Super Mario Bros. 3, Duck Hunt. It had Kirby. This system really shaped what the Nintendo brand would go on to be. And while it is the simplest in the Nintendo graphics, the games are still popular, even being popular today on Nintendo Switch consoles. So the controller for the NES is kind of the classic rectangle controller with the Nintendo, at the time, proprietary D-pad on the left, D-pad standing for directional pad, and then on the right is an A and B button, with in the center a select and start button. This would kind of establish a sort of very simplistic idea of what a video game controller should be, and it worked very, very well for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, it did kind of cut into your hands and could be a little, sore after hours and hours of gameplay, but Nintendo eventually did create a dog bone styled controller that would eventually carry over to the Super Nintendo. Released August 14th, 1989, the Sega Genesis is perhaps most famously known for its Sonic series. Now, Sonic did exist prior to this on the Sega Master System, but on the Sega Genesis, where 16-bit would get the jump before Nintendo released its Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis had a leg up, and Sonic, as we know it with Sonic 1, 2, and 3, just looked fantastic. Sonic 1, 2, and 3 are some of the most classic video games in video game history, and people are still playing them today on modern systems. The Sega Genesis really would push Nintendo to make the Super Nintendo, and it was just simply a fun system that offered more adult-oriented games that Nintendo wasn't offering players. You would have a lot more fighting games, and there would be some violence there. So Sega and Nintendo always kind of were like the yin and yang for each other. Nintendo being the more family-oriented system, and continuing to be so to this day. Released in August 23rd, 1991 in North America, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Super NES, was just a graphical powerhouse for Nintendo. At 16 whole bits, it was 8 more bits than the Nintendo Entertainment System. So you can probably tell already, we're getting into those big numbers. Now, I know in 2020, 16-bit and 8-bit sounds so small, and let's be honest, it is. But back in 1991, this jump in graphics allowed the Super Nintendo system to do things like have backgrounds that would move as you would scroll through the level, and would have different levels of depth to the background, would allow more detail to be placed into the pixels, as characters could now have more pixels. It sounds pretty, simple now, but back then, this was a pretty big graphical leap. And after the Super Nintendo, things would go to 32-bit, and then eventually we would see the polygons. The Super Nintendo had so many popular games that have become legendary in video game history in themselves. Just to name some of them, we had The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, which would go on to establish Zelda as one of Nintendo's main focuses for video games. While there were 2 previous ones for the Nintendo Entertainment System, A Link to the Past really established the Zelda world and added a new sense of clarity to the visuals that just simply were not possible on the Nintendo Entertainment System. We had games like Yoshi's Island, F-Zero, Earthbound, Chrono Trigger. If you're an RPG fan, Chrono Trigger took the art from Akira Toriyama, who did the art for Dragon Ball Z, very popular anime, and attributed it to a video game for, at the time, Squaresoft, who would go on to become Square Enix. Then we had games like fighting games like Street Fighter, and we had Super Mario RPG. We had Super Mario Kart, which would go on to establish the Mario Kart series. Of course, we all know Mario Kart. If you're a video game fan, you've probably played a Mario Kart game. And then you have the Donkey Kong Country series. And while Donkey Kong existed in an arcade-like format for the Nintendo Entertainment System and even on Atari, Donkey Kong Country, developed by Rare, who would go on to make so many classic games such as Banjo-Kazooie would establish Donkey Kong's lore and characters such as Diddy Kong and, well, Donkey Kong himself. Polygons, polygons, polygons. It's finally time to talk about one of my favorite video game systems of all time. I'm, of course, talking about the Nintendo 64. Now, when I was 9 years old, and this system had already admittedly been out for a couple years, I got this thing, and it felt like I was streaming. I still remember that Christmas. So, naturally, I'm going to talk about it here. The Nintendo 64 was released September 29th, 1996 in America, and June 23rd, 1996 in Japan. One of its launch video game titles was Super Mario 64, which is just a classic. I mean, they even recently re-released that video game for the Nintendo Switch in a 3D Mario package, and that is kind of the biggest thing about the N64. 3D. The polygons in this thing, they basically would take old Nintendo games and rework them into a 3D world with 3D graphics. The polygons were very simplistic, and polygons are kind of, they're a type of 3D shape that make up the visuals in these consoles games. So you would go and you would play Zelda, or in this case, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and then later The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, which was a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time, even though it was vastly different. And you would get the graphics that you would experience on the Super Nintendo completely done in 3D. So you could walk around in a 3D world. You could, go play sports games in 3D, like 3D golfing, 3D football. There was a Madden on N64. All you Madden fans out there, Madden. There was everything on the N64. There was Super Mario Kart, now titled Mario Kart 64, and it was in 3D. And sure, some games didn't fully use polygons. They used a sort of mix of flat graphics with that, Mario Kart 64 being one of them, but the game itself was in 3D, and just to have those 3D graphics now being rendered on the screen was really cool for players, and personally, it was really cool for me when it happened. Now, the graphics for this thing, by today's standards, it's not a powerhouse, but still, it was really cool. The base N64 had 4 megabytes, that's right, megabytes of RAM. You could put an expansion pack in that upped that to 8 megabytes. And that let you play certain games like Donkey Kong 64. We remember talking about Donkey Kong for the Super Nintendo. And it allowed you to do things like add AI bots to other games and add content to other games that simply could not be played with the smaller amount of RAM. Man, 4 megabits or megabytes of RAM, like the difference, it doesn't sound like much, because by today's standards, like a photograph on our phones can be like 32. So our the pictures on our phones like blow the N64's RAM out of the water. It's just insane. But the N64 really was one of the revolutionary at-home consoles. Computers had 3D graphics at this point of time, but other consoles tried to do this. The N64 really kind of made it the standard, which makes it kind of interesting because the N64 actually, out of all the Nintendo consoles, did not sell very well in comparison. Worldwide to date, it has only sold 32.93 million, and that sounds like a lot, but in America, it had only sold 20 million. And you have to remember, the Nintendo Entertainment System, the very first one, sold almost double what the N64 sold. It's crazy, but it is still one of my favorite video game systems. But one of the parts of this video game system that isn't necessarily my favorite and isn't a lot of people's favorites is the controller. Now, the controller is shaped in a sort of trident shape, and it kind of takes what we knew about video game controllers and turns it on its head. Nintendo admittedly went away from this design and went to a more comfortable GameCube controller when they would release the GameCube. and that would be a lot nicer than this one was. And now we're kind of in the boat where we have similar controllers to basically other systems, but the N64, it tried new fun things, and it did some things well and some things not so well. Sony released their PlayStation in December 3rd, 1994, and this was almost 2 years earlier than the N64, which is kind of interesting to consider when you realize that these two systems were kind of competing. Now, the PlayStation is really important because not only did it move to a disc-based format, but it was a system that was supposed to actually be made in partnership with none other than Nintendo. Nintendo even prototyped a console with PlayStation that would use discs, but they never actually went on to make their system, and they backed out of that deal and would go on to actually make the N64 that we know of today. Now, the PlayStation, since it used discs, it could actually store so much more data than the N64's cartridges that it would continue to use, because Nintendo up to this point was using cartridges for all of its systems. So PlayStation was able to get really popular for a lot of RPG games. That stands for role-playing games, for those of you who don't know. And a lot of games such as the Final Fantasy series would get really popular on PlayStation, such as Final Fantasy VII, which has just undergone a remake for the PlayStation 4. You'll realize as you play video games and learn about video games that a lot of these games are so treasured from this generation especially that they've been undergoing different remakes or remasters throughout time. Now, the PlayStation, its controller has really not changed a whole lot since this initial system. It started out without any joysticks whatsoever and just had a D-pad and 4 face buttons and then 2 shoulder buttons on each side, an R1, an L1, an L2, and an R2, left and right respectively for those. The PlayStation would then add joysticks, and that very controller essentially would exist up until the PlayStation 5, in which they got really creative. Of course, they would add technologies throughout the different PlayStation iterations, and it would initially be called the DualShock 1, then go on to be a DualShock 2, etc., etc. PlayStation has a huge library. A huge library. So there are so many different games you can play on this thing, whether it be a platformer, whether it be a sports game, or whether it be the previously mentioned RPGs. And so many of those games franchises have gone on to survive to this day, including Tomb Raider. So it is really a beloved system that continues to dominate the market share of video games. Of course, the newest one is the one that dominates now. Released November 27th, 1998 in Japan and September 9th, 1999 in North America, the Sega Dreamcast would be the system that would be the downfall of Sega as a console maker. Its lifespan only existed for about 3 years, and the console itself has actually gained a sort of cult status. It's actually kind of impressive. Now, this system would only sell 9.13 million copies, which sounds like a lot yet again, but really it's not. I mean, think about it. The N64 is considered to not have sold many, and it sold 30 million. This thing sold 3 times less. So I feel really bad for Sega for what happened here, but ultimately the failure of Sega to actually meet expectations with this system and the looming PlayStation 2, which would put the nail in the coffin for the Sega Dreamcast, would ultimately drive Sega's console business into the ground, and they would switch to become a video game maker for all of the video game consoles. Instead of just making their own consoles, they would bring Sonic to all the different gaming systems. And the Dreamcast, with its 3D graphics, unique controller, which had a VMU, or virtual memory unit that was almost like a little screen that you popped inside of your controller that had a little like mini games that you could play on there, and you could actually visualize your memory. It was kind of a prediction to what would become the Nintendo Wii U or even the Nintendo Switch if you really think about it. Having a little screen inside of your controller, the Dreamcast was ahead of its time. It even had online play, and it would go to directly influence Microsoft's Xbox. Released October 26th in the year 2000. The new millennial, actually. It's kind of cool if you think about it. The PlayStation 2 is the greatest selling video game console of all time. This thing has sold, just get ready for this, 155 million units as of March 31st, 2012. So this thing's probably sold even more since then. That is insane. And now you probably understand why the N64 is considered not a good selling console in video game history. And the PlayStation 2 would just really take what the PlayStation 1 did and give it better graphics. It would have a network attachment so you could play online video games. And it would have some of the most iconic RPGs of all time. And it would be a very, very good system for people who liked racing simulation, who likes sports. This just took the whole like plethora of video games and turned it up like 1.5 million degrees. It's really insane what the PlayStation 2 was able to accomplish. Of course, this thing had 32 megabytes of RAM. Think about that. The N64, which was the previous system, had 4, and then with the expansion pack 8, now we're at 32. Things are getting big. But this system had many popular games such as Kingdom Hearts 2 on it, Kingdom Hearts 1. It had so many games like Tony Hawk Pro Skater series, and there's just a video game for every different genre that someone loved on this. Nintendo would release the GameCube. The GameCube was released November 18th, 2001. As you can tell, Nintendo tends to release their video game systems pretty late. And by pretty late, I mean like a year later or so. This has been pretty typical for Nintendo, although now with their modern systems, they kind of just do their own thing. But the GameCube would, again, go in a strange direction with the actual video game format. It would finally adopt discs, but it would put it on these really tiny GameCube proprietary discs that were just so small. And again, because they were small, they couldn't carry as much data. And I think it was an anti-piracy thing, but it really didn't make much sense for the time. But the GameCube still was a pretty popular system. And it had games like Super Smash Bros. Melee. Super Smash Bros. Originally appeared on the N64 and then got improved for this, where it really took off. And a lot of these games, Mario Kart still included on here with Mario Kart Double Dash, would become staples in the series and grow and improve upon each iteration of Nintendo's console. Now, the Nintendo GameCube controller is more in line with what modern controllers are like, with 2 handles that you kind of hold on to and a very ergonomic thought behind the controller, especially after the N64 controller, which was a trident shaped and just, it was weird. It was just weird. This is weird but comfy, and it is somewhat logical along the way. The Nintendo GameCube still maintained 4 ports, and this is kind of cool because a lot of video game systems would not really incorporate the ports, and by that I mean look at PlayStation. Xbox would have 4 ports, thankfully, but the PlayStation continued to have only 2 plugins for its ports for their controllers. So I should correct myself. By ports, I mean you can plug in your controller to this thing. Nintendo has always been a very big pusher of playing locally on the same TV, where other video game console makers have kind of made a push to buy their console and not play locally. But anyways, the GameCube system would go on to be a very popular system in the Nintendo franchise. Utilizing DirectX, Microsoft would go on to create The Xbox. Of course, we all, if you play video games, know what an Xbox is at this point of time. But previous to November 15th, 2001, you might not know what an Xbox is. Now, the Xbox was one of the first video game consoles to be made solely in America in a very, very long time at that point of time. Previous to that, the one that was made in America before the Xbox was Atari's Jaguar, which is a system that didn't do so well. I hate to say it. But the Xbox, obviously, has continued to be a staple in video game history. Now, this system was ahead of its time in many ways. It had a controller that is very modern. The same controller layout is, for the most part, used today. They now have extra shoulder buttons, and they've ditched their black and white buttons, but the joystick, D-pad, face button layout is pretty much the same. It had a hard drive built into the Xbox, and you could use an Ethernet cable to connect to the internet with a service that still basically goes on today called Xbox Live, which is a fee-based video game system in which you can access the internet and play games online with your friends. Now, the Xbox, it really, really took off because of one game that would make the system a must-have at the time. I'm, of course, talking about Halo Combat Evolved. Halo sold 1 million copies by April 2002. This is a huge amount for a video game. And the system would essentially not only launch itself into the mainstream, but it would launch Halo as a must-have game to play. I remember personally, I had many a Halo LAN party, and Halo is coming out with a new video game very, very soon, possibly this year it looks like, called Halo Infinite. And there has been so many Halo games since this Halo for all of the Xbox systems. And man, the Xbox naming scheme after the original Xbox just gets weird. You have the Xbox 360, you have the Xbox One, which would then get a sort of upgraded version called the Xbox One X. And then, you have the Xbox One S. And then, of course, now we have the Xbox Series and the Xbox Series X. And yeah, Xbox, I don't know what they're doing with their naming scheme, but it can get confusing. But this is the original Xbox, or as I like to call it, the OG Xbox. Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip through most of the modern consoles really quickly. We're just going to do a rundown of them because I think it's important to talk about them. And there's so many video games that we could be here, for hours on end. So with the Xbox, as we talked about, it would go on to make the Xbox 360. The 360 would still have the hard drive, still run on discs, and would improve upon the 3D graphics of the original Xbox, getting actually a lot more detailed and enter the realm of HD. You could actually play games in HD. PlayStation would also do this. They would go from the PlayStation 2 and they would make the PlayStation 3. The PlayStation 3 was incredibly expensive when it first came out. We're talking $600 at the time. And this would also have a built-in hard drive, so you could save your saves to it and download digital games to it actually. Same with the Xbox 360, and you could play them directly off of that hard drive. Now, the PlayStation would release slim versions. The Xbox would do kind of the equal thing for the 360 and release better versions, but the Xbox 360 infamously would have the red ring of death problem. It was something like 50% of Xbox 360s would end up just dying. They would overheat all the time. You couldn't play them. It was a huge problem, and buying a used original Xbox 360 was pretty tough. That would be resolved once they would release new iterations of that console, but you had to be really careful when you bought the original version of the Xbox 360. Nintendo, of course, would spice things up, and they would release the Nintendo Wii, which would be a huge hit. No one really knew what Nintendo was going to do because this thing was basically the same power as a Nintendo GameCube. But the Nintendo Wii, use the gimmick of motion controls and bringing video games closer to people who are non-gamers. So Nintendo Wii, you could go bowling, you could play Wii Golf, you could do so many things. And of course, the Nintendo staples were all there, including Mario Kart, which we keep talking about. But Nintendo, they keep revitalizing their same games, and they continue to keep their first-party games pushing their system sales. And that is one thing about Nintendo. It doesn't really matter how strong their systems are. Nintendo's first-party games are so polished that they never have to really worry about selling their consoles. Now, after this, Nintendo would release the Wii U. The Wii U would not sell very well. It was stronger than the Wii, and it is a good console in what it is used for. The screen is in the gamepad that you hold, and you can actually play a lot of games directly on that or play it on the TV. But Nintendo would eventually redeem itself after poor sales from that console with what we have now, the Nintendo Switch. PlayStation would go on to release the PlayStation 4, which was the previous generation now. It's still crazy to me to even think that the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One are previous gen. But alas, here we are now with the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series. Now, the Xbox Series has the Xbox Series X and the Xbox Series S. The Xbox Series S being more geared towards 1080p gameplay, the Xbox Series X being more geared towards 4K gameplay, because we now live in the world of 4K. HD on top of HD on top of HD. It's just so many pixels. 4K, so many people have 4K TVs that this is something people want, but a lot of people like me like to stick with 1080p and just get better performance and frame rates. So you're all caught up with video game history, and I hope that we were all able to sort of learn how they evolved. There's so many consoles in between these that I can't even talk about because there's just so many that we could be here for days. There's companies like Neo Geo and TurboGrafx, and there's just so many. So I really encourage you to go check out books at the library, and there's just so many digital things out there about these video game systems. And of course, the library has video games that you yourself can check out and play. I hope you guys like this video, like this program that I did here for the library. I would love to know what some of your favorite video game systems are. So, if you ever stopping by the library Facebook, or if you, wherever you're watching this video, make sure to, talk about it and talk about it with your friends. Maybe you learned something here, maybe you didn't, I don't know. But hopefully this has kind of informed you a little bit more about the rich history of video games. And we all also have our own personal histories with video games. And I'm sure you have your own personal video game history of the consoles you've owned through your life that are very impactful to you. And I think that's so cool. I think really take time to think about what went into these video games and what went into some of your favorite video games, because I think you'll be surprised how much time and effort actually goes into developing these consoles and how the journey has gone for the companies that have made these things. And video games are a huge distraction to us, especially in these crazy times where we're dealing with pandemics. So they offer a great amount of joy to a lot of people, and there's a deep history there. So I hope you enjoyed the program and this video, and this has been Sam from the library. I will see you all another time. I hope you enjoyed this.